The first breath was a mistake. It wasn't air. It was a fist of hot poison, clawing down Alara Vance's throat. Her eyes snapped open not to the gentle pre-dawn gray she was used to, but to a roiling, venomous darkness. The air was thick, tasting of burnt plastic and something acridly chemical. It was a texture more than a smell, a suffocating wool blanket pressed against her face. Then came the sound, not the gentle hum of the old house settling, but a deafening, hungry roar, the sound of a beast chewing through the walls of her life. Fire. The word didn't so much form in her mind as explode. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, lanced through the sleepy fog. She threw off her single thin sheet, the air already blisteringly hot against her skin. Smoke billowed under her bedroom door, thick and black as crude oil. There was no time for thought, no time for plans. There was only a primal, three-part mantra chanting in her soul. Liam, Maya, Ben. She ripped the pillowcase from her pillow and stumbled toward the small ensuite bathroom, soaking it under the tap. The water was already running warm. How long? How long had the beast been feeding? She pressed the wet cloth to her face and dropped to the floor, where the air was marginally clearer. The smoke was a living thing, a predator slithering in the shadows. She crawled, her knees scraping against the worn wooden floorboards, toward the door. The brass knob was a brand. She recoiled with a hiss, wrapping her hand in the hem of her pajama shirt before trying again. The hallway was a vision from hell. Orange light pulsed at the far end, near the kitchen, casting, dancing, demonic shadows that writhed on the walls. The roar was louder here, punctuated by the sharp crackle of wood surrendering to the flames. It was a living, breathing monster, and it stood between her and the children's bedrooms. "Liam!" she screamed, her voice a shredded mess. "Maya! Ben! Wake up!" Did they hear her? Or was the monster's voice the only thing they could hear? The smoke was a physical barrier, stinging her eyes until tears streamed down her soot-stained cheeks. She crawled faster, the heat intensifying with every foot, the floorboards groaning beneath her. The family photos on the wall were melting, the smiling faces of the children she'd sworn to protect, distorting into grotesque masks before blistering into blackness. She reached Liam's door first. It was closed. A small miracle. She threw it open. He was already awake, standing by the bed where he'd managed to wake his two younger siblings. Maya was crying silently, her small face a mask of terror, while 5-year-old Ben was simply staring, his thumb in his mouth, at the horrifying orange glow under the door. Liam, ever the stoic 10-year-old protector, stood in front of them, his small body tense. "Ellie!" he cried, a wave of relief and terror washing over his face. "We're getting out," Ellie said, her voice a low, urgent rasp. She pulled them down to the floor with her. "Stay low. Cover your mouths. We're going to the back door." She herded them out into the hallway. The beast had grown bolder, its fiery tendrils now licking at the ceiling just a dozen feet away. The heat was immense, a physical weight pressing down on them. They moved in a small, desperate huddle, a mother hen and her chicks scuttling away from a fox. The main escape route, the front door, was already engulfed in a wall of flame. The back door, through the living room, was their only chance. They were almost there when the world seemed to splinter. A sound like a giant sigh, a deep, structural groan echoed above them. Ellie looked up. A thick, blackened support beam in the ceiling, its integrity devoured by the fire, was giving way. It sagged, then cracked, a shower of glowing embers raining down around them. There was no time to run. In a single, fluid motion born of pure instinct, Ellie acted. She shoved the 3 children against the wall, into a small alcove beneath the bay window. "Stay down!" she screamed. She grabbed the heavy woolen throw blanket from the arm of the sofa, a gift from her grandmother, her last remaining family member. It was thick, dense, and blessedly non-flammable. As the beam began its final, terrible descent, she threw the blanket over the children, creating a small, dark tent. Then, without a second's hesitation, she curled her own body over them, making her back a final, living shield. The impact was a concussive blast of force and heat that drove the air from her lungs. The beam didn't land directly on her, but glanced off the wall above, showering her in a deluge of flaming debris and scorching embers. Pain, white-hot and absolute, exploded across her back and shoulders. It felt as if 1,000 needles, heated in a forge, were being driven into her skin. She bit back a scream, tasting blood. Beneath her, she could feel the small bodies of the children trembling. Ben was wailing now, his terror finally finding a voice. "It's okay," she choked out, the lie tasting like ash. "I've got you. I've got you. It's okay. I'm right here." The smoke was impossibly thick now, a choking shroud. The heat was unbearable. Her vision began to tunnel, the edges blurring into a fuzzy gray. She fought to stay conscious, focusing on the terrified sobs beneath her. "I've got you." The roar of the fire was beginning to sound distant, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in her ears. Her world narrowed to the small patch of floor beneath her, to the precious, fragile lives she was protecting. Just as the darkness threatened to consume her completely, she heard a new sound. The shattering of glass, followed by shouts, heavy, thudding footsteps. A different kind of voice, one of authority, cutting through the chaos. "We've got survivors!" Hands, strong and urgent, were on her, trying to pull her away. She resisted, a primal growl rumbling in her chest. "The kids!" she rasped, her lungs on fire. "Get the kids!" The last thing she saw before the world went black was a firefighter in full gear lifting a soot-stained, crying Maya into his arms. They were alive. Liam, Maya, Ben, they were alive. The thought was a small, cool comfort as she finally let the crushing darkness pull her under. The first sensation was a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to emanate from her very bones. The second was the sterile, antiseptic smell that instantly signaled a hospital. Ellie's eyelids felt as if they were glued shut. She pried them open to a world of blinding white ceilings and the quiet, rhythmic beep of a machine beside her. A thin, scratchy blanket was pulled up to her chin. An IV line snaked into the back of her hand. "The children?" she croaked, her throat feeling like sandpaper. "Are they?" A nurse bustled in, offering a small cup of water with a straw. "They're fine," she said, her tone efficient but not unkind. "A little smoke inhalation, but they're champs. Kept asking for you." Relief washed over Ellie so powerfully it left her dizzy. It was a fragile, fleeting moment of peace before the door opened again, and the real nightmare began. A doctor, a man in his 50s with a tired, impatient face, stood at the foot of her bed, flipping through a chart on a clipboard. "Miss Vance," he began, not making eye contact. "I'm Dr. Albright. You have second-degree burns on your back and shoulders, and severe smoke inhalation. We're going to keep you for at least a day for observation." He finally looked at her, his eyes cool and appraising. "The children are physically unharmed, which is fortunate." The word fortunate hung in the air, weighted with unspoken meaning. It didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like an accusation. "Can I see them?" Ellie asked, trying to push herself up and wincing as a fresh wave of pain seared across her back. "They're being evaluated," Dr. Albright said curtly. "And Child Protective Services has been notified, as is standard procedure in these cases. They'll need to speak with them, and with you." Before Ellie could process the cold dread that statement produced, 2 police officers appeared at her door. One was young, and looked vaguely sympathetic. The other was older, with a weary, cynical set to his jaw. It was the older one, Officer Miller, who did the talking. "Ma'am, we just need to ask a few questions about the fire," he said, his voice a gravelly monotone. He held a small notebook. His questions came like small, sharp jabs, each one landing with the sting of suspicion. "Did you have working smoke detectors?" "Yes, of course," Ellie said. "The one in the hall went off, but not the one in your room. Records show the fire started in the kitchen. It would have had to be quite advanced to reach the hallway detector without the closer ones triggering." "Were the batteries old?" I don't know. I checked them, but..." "Were you smoking in the house, ma'am?" "No, I don't smoke." "Any electrical problems you'd been meaning to fix? Frayed cords? Overloaded outlets?" "We found an old power strip near the refrigerator that was badly melted." Each question chipped away at her heroism, reframing her as neglectful, incompetent. She was the victim, the one who had run into the fire, yet here she was, being treated like the one who lit the match. She felt a rising tide of indignant frustration. She tried to explain about the faulty wiring in the old rental house, the landlord she could never get a hold of, the constant struggle to make ends meet that meant a new power strip was a luxury, not a priority. But her words came out in a weak, defensive croak, and Officer Miller just made another dispassionate note in his book. As the officers were leaving, she saw a familiar figure down the hall, speaking with another policeman. Brenda Higgins, her next-door neighbor. Brenda, who always seemed to be watching from behind her pristine curtains, whose lips were permanently pursed in a silent judgment of Ellie's slightly too long grass or the noisy games the children played in the yard. Brenda caught Ellie's eye. She offered a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, a grotesque pantomime of concern. Then she turned back to the officer, her expression shifting to one of grave, solemn importance. Ellie couldn't hear the words, but she could read the performance. The head shaking, the hand wringing, always so much noise, never seemed to have things under control, a tragedy waiting to happen. Brenda was positioning herself not as a neighbor, but as a key witness to a disaster she had apparently long predicted. The injustice of it was a bitter pill to swallow. The final, crushing blow of the day arrived in a crisp shirt and a perfectly knotted tie. His name was Mr. Davies, and he was from Child Protective Services. He was a man who seemed to have had all emotion and empathy systematically ironed out of him. He stood by her bed, holding a clipboard like a scepter of power, and radiated an aura of cold, bureaucratic certainty. He didn't offer a single word of sympathy. He didn't acknowledge the burns on her back or the terror she must have felt. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. "I am Mr. Davies. I'm the caseworker assigned to Liam, Maya, and Benjamin Foster." He used their legal last names, a deliberate choice to remind Ellie that her connection to them was conditional, contractual. "I need to inform you," he continued, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall just above her head, "that due to the fire and the subsequent loss of your home, the children have been placed in the temporary emergency custody of the state. It's a standard protocol to ensure their safety and stability during the investigation." "Oh," the phrase hung in the air. "The investigation. An investigation into what? Into her? Into her selfless act of saving them?" "What?" "No," Ellie stammered, the words catching in her throat. "No, you can't. They need me. They've been through enough." "Where are they?" "They are in a safe and certified receiving home," Davies said, unmoved. "You will not be permitted contact until my preliminary assessment is complete. We cannot risk further destabilization." "Risk?" she repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "I just pulled them out of a fire. I risked everything for them." "And that is one of the circumstances we will be thoroughly reviewing," he said, a flicker of something annoyance in his eyes. He made a neat checkmark on a form on his clipboard. "Your heroism is noted, Miss Vance, but so is the fact that the children were in your care when they were placed in a life-threatening situation. The state must consider all angles. Protocol is not concerned with sentiment." He was turning her love into a liability, her sacrifice into a statistic. Desperation clawed at her. "Please," she begged, the word tearing from her raw throat. "They're just children. They're scared. They need to see a familiar face. They need me." Mr. Davies finally looked at her, his expression as blank and unyielding as a concrete wall. "What they need, Miss Vance, is a stable environment. My job is to determine if you can still provide one. That is all." He turned and walked out, his polished shoes clicking softly on the linoleum floor. Ellie was left alone in the stark white room, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, the only sound. The fire had taken her home, but it was this man, this system, that was threatening to take her soul. The physical pain from her burns was nothing compared to the cold, creeping terror that was now taking root in her heart. She wasn't a hero, she was a suspect, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The hospital discharged Ellie 24 hours later with a tube of burn cream, a prescription for painkillers, and a pamphlet on victim support services that felt like a cruel joke. She walked out into a world that no longer felt like hers. A charity had put her up in a dingy motel on the edge of town, a place that smelled of stale cigarettes and despair. The floral-patterned bedspread was thin and stained. The window looked out onto a crumbling brick wall, and the constant hum of the ice machine in the hall was a maddening soundtrack to her new reality. Her first call was to the number Mr. Davies had reluctantly given her. A receptionist answered, her voice bored. Mr. Davies was in a meeting. No, she didn't know when he'd be free. No, she was not authorized to give out any information about the children's whereabouts or condition. Ellie called every hour for the rest of the day. He was always in a meeting, or out of the office, or unavailable. It was a bureaucratic fortress, and she couldn't find a way in. On the third day, a thick, cream-colored envelope was slipped under her motel room door. It was from the bank. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. The language was dense and legalistic, but the message was brutally clear. The fire had rendered the property uninhabitable, a violation of Clause 17B in her mortgage agreement. As the property no longer served as adequate collateral for the loan, they were exercising their right to accelerate the debt. The full remaining balance of her mortgage was due in 30 days. Failure to pay would result in immediate foreclosure. Ellie sank onto the lumpy bed, the letter falling from her numb fingers. It was absurd. She didn't have $30 for a decent meal, let alone the $89,000 she owed on a house that was now nothing more than a blackened skeleton. She had poured every penny she had, every ounce of her energy, into that home, trying to create a haven for children who had never known one. Now the bank was kicking her out of the ashes. The system, it seemed, had 100 different ways to punish her. A week after the fire, Mr. Davies finally summoned her to his office. The CPS building was a sterile, beige labyrinth of cubicles and quiet misery. Davies sat behind a large metal desk, a fortress of paperwork separating them. He didn't offer her a seat until he had finished meticulously arranging a stack of files. "Miss Vance," he began, steepling his fingers, "my investigation is proceeding. I have conducted preliminary interviews with the children." Ellie leaned forward, her heart aching. "How are they? Are they okay? Are they together?" "They are processing the traumatic event, each in their own way," he said, evading the core of her question. "Liam is reserved. He feels a great deal of responsibility. Maya has been drawing pictures, mostly of fires." He paused, letting the clinical observation land with calculated weight. "And Benjamin has been asking for you." A flicker of hope ignited in Ellie's chest. "Then let me see them. Please. It would help him. It would help all of them." "That would be counterproductive at this stage," Davies said smoothly. "My concern is that your presence would interfere with an objective assessment of the events leading up to the fire. For instance, Liam mentioned that you sometimes worked late, and he would have to help get dinner started for his siblings." "I worked a second job as a waitress to buy him a new pair of sneakers," Ellie burst out, aghast. "He offered to help put the frozen pizza in the oven. He's a good kid. How can you twist that into neglect?" Davies simply raised an eyebrow. "I don't twist things, Miss Vance. I document them. I also have a statement from your neighbor, Miss Higgins, expressing long-held concerns about the level of supervision at the residence." That night, the true poison of Brenda's campaign was revealed. Ellie was watching the local news on the motel's fuzzy television when a familiar face appeared on the screen. It was Brenda, standing in front of Ellie's ruined home, a backdrop she had clearly chosen for maximum dramatic effect. She wore a look of profound, sorrowful concern. "You just pray everyone is all right," Brenda said to the reporter, her voice trembling slightly. "But when you see things, you know." Loud noises at all hours, the children often playing outside by themselves. You just wonder if it's a stable environment. One has to wonder if they were properly supervised on the night of the fire. It's a tragedy, but perhaps a preventable one. The insinuation was a physical blow. Brenda had turned Ellie's poverty and the simple, joyful chaos of raising 3 children into evidence for the prosecution. The internet was even crueler. The news station posted the clip online, and the comment section was a sewer of anonymous judgment. Probably left a cigarette burning? Trying to get the insurance money? Some people should not be allowed to have kids. Ellie was being tried and convicted by a jury of strangers who had read a headline and seen a 30-second clip of her venomous neighbor. She felt invisible, her true self erased and replaced by a caricature of a negligent, unfit guardian. Her breaking point came during a formal hearing 2 weeks after the fire. It was held in a small, windowless conference room. It was just her, Davies, and his supervisor, a woman who looked just as weary and indifferent as he did. Davies laid out his case with the dispassionate precision of an executioner. He presented a folder thick with his findings. He had photographs of the burned-out kitchen, highlighting the old power strip. He had a copy of the fire marshal's inconclusive report, which he interpreted as implicitly damning. He had notes from his interviews with the children, filled with out-of-context quotes that made them sound like neglected victims. He had Brenda's official, notarized statement. He even had a report showing the house had a leaky faucet in the bathroom that hadn't been repaired. "What does a leaky faucet have to do with a fire?" Ellie asked, her voice shaking with a rage that felt perilously close to hysteria. "It speaks to a pattern of deferred maintenance," Davies replied calmly. "A household that is not being kept in a state of good repair. It is a data point, Miss Vance. My report is built on data points, and the data suggests a chaotic and ultimately unsafe environment." He leaned back, his work done. "Therefore, my official recommendation to the court will be to permanently terminate your foster care license and place the children in a long-term therapeutic group home where their complex needs can be properly addressed." The room fell silent. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. Group home. A sterile, institutional place. The very thing she had fought so hard to save them from. Liam, Maya, and Ben wouldn't be together. They would be scattered, broken, their fragile bond shattered by the very system meant to protect them. "No," Ellie whispered, the word a ragged breath. "You can't. They are a family. They have me, and I have them. You can't do this." Tears streamed freely down her face. Tears of anger, of grief, of utter, crushing helplessness. "I saved their lives. I have burns on my back to prove it. Doesn't that count for anything?" Mr. Davies looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something behind his blank expression. It wasn't malice. It was something worse. A profound, unshakable belief in his own righteousness. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice softening into a tone of condescending pity that was more infuriating than his coldness. "The fire may have ended, but my job is to protect those children from all the embers left behind, including, if necessary, you." She walked out of that building into the harsh afternoon sun, hollowed out. The system hadn't just failed her, it had consumed her. It had taken her heroism and branded it as negligence. It had taken her love and labeled it a liability. She was a good person who had done a brave thing, and for that, she was about to lose everything that mattered. There was no one left to call, nowhere left to turn. The beast hadn't been the fire. The beast was the system, and it had finally, completely devoured her. The final morning dawned gray and oppressive. The sky, the color of dirty dishwater. It was a perfect mirror of the emptiness inside Ellie. There was a knock on the thin motel room door at precisely 9 o'clock. She knew who it was. She opened it to find Mr. Davies looking as immaculate and impassive as ever. Beside him stood a young, nervous-looking woman holding a folder the social worker assigned to transport the children. Behind them, in the parking lot, was a generic government sedan. And in the back seat, Ellie could see them. 3 small pale faces pressed against the window. Liam was staring straight ahead, his jaw set, trying to be brave. Maya was clutching a worn teddy bear, her eyes wide and frightened. Ben had his face turned away, a small, stubborn protest against the unfolding tragedy. "Miss Vance," Davies said, his voice holding a note of finality, "these are the official court orders. The children are now permanent wards of the state. I thought it best they be allowed to see you one last time, for the sake of closure." It was the cruelest gesture of all, dangling them in front of her like a prize she had lost. He wasn't doing it for them, he was doing it to her, a final, bureaucratic assertion of his power. Ellie's legs felt weak. She leaned against the doorframe, her gaze locked on the children in the car. Her children, her family, being taken away in a beige sedan to be filed away in the system. All her fight was gone, replaced by a vast, aching void. The tears she thought she had run out of began to fall again, silent and defeated. "Goodbye, my loves," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind. The young social worker looked down at her shoes, a flush of shame on her cheeks. Even she seemed to know this was wrong. Davies, however, merely straightened his tie, ready to conclude his business. And then, it happened. A vehicle turned into the motel parking lot, moving with a silent, confident grace that was utterly alien to the rundown surroundings. It was a black sedan, but it was nothing like the government car. This one was polished to a mirror shine, long and sleek, with tinted windows that seemed to absorb the bleak morning light. It parked directly behind Davies's car, blocking it in. The driver's side door opened, and a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit stepped out. He was tall and lean, with silvering hair at his temples, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He moved with an unhurried, powerful calm that instantly drew every eye. This was a man accustomed to being the center of any room or parking lot he entered. He was followed by a woman in an equally sharp business suit, carrying a leather briefcase. The man walked directly toward their small, miserable group. He didn't look at Ellie or the social worker. His eyes, a startlingly clear and intelligent blue, were fixed entirely on Mr. Cotta. "Davies." "Mr. Davies?" the man asked. His voice was quiet, but it resonated with an unmistakable authority that cut through the morning air. Davies, flustered by this unexpected interruption, puffed out his chest. "I am. And who might you be?" "This is an official CPS matter. My name is Silas Blackwood," the man said simply. He gestured to the woman beside him. "This is my legal counsel, Miss Albright. You will not be taking these children anywhere." The statement was delivered not as a request or a threat, but as a simple declaration of fact. The sun had decided it would no longer rise in the east. The tides had ceased to turn. Davies blinked, momentarily stunned into silence. "I beg your pardon?" Davies finally sputtered, regaining some of his bureaucratic bluster. "I have a court order. I am acting with the full authority of the state." "An authority you are about to find severely curtailed?" Miss Albright, the lawyer, interjected smoothly. She opened her briefcase. "My firm was retained by Mr. Blackwood this morning. We have already filed an emergency motion to stay the court's order, pending a full review of your conduct. The State Director of Child and Family Services has been notified. He is, I believe, very interested to learn why a caseworker would actively work to discredit a documented hero and traumatize 3 vulnerable children in the process." The color drained from Mr. Davies's face. The names and titles being thrown around were far above his pay grade. His shield of protocol was being pierced by weapons he didn't know how to defend against. It was only then that the man, Silas Blackwood, turned his attention to Ellie. His intense gaze softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than power in his eyes, a deep, ancient sadness. "You are Elara Vance," he said, his voice now gentle. He took a step closer, his eyes scanning her face, then flickering to the healing burns visible on her arms. Ellie could only nod, her mind struggling to catch up with the seismic shift that had just occurred. Who was this man? Where had he come from? "I read about you," Blackwood explained, seeming to understand her confusion. "It wasn't a big story, just a small piece on a local news blog, buried under everything else. It mentioned the firefighters' report. It said you used your own body to shield the children from a falling beam." He paused, and his voice grew thick with an emotion that felt raw and genuine. "Someone did that for me once, a long time ago, in a fire much like yours." He glanced over at the car where the children were still watching, their faces a mixture of fear and dawning wonder. For the first time since the fire, a tiny, impossible seed of hope began to sprout in the barren landscape of Ellie's heart. The man who had materialized from nowhere wasn't just a powerful stranger, he was someone who understood. Silas Blackwood operated with the swift, decisive efficiency of a man who bent the world to his will simply by expecting it to bend. The motel parking lot transformed from a scene of quiet despair into the headquarters of a counteroffensive. "Mr. Davies," Miss Albright said, her voice crisp and cutting, "you have 2 options. You can relinquish custody of the children to Miss Vance here and now, pending the outcome of our motion, or you can explain your refusal to a judge in approximately 45 minutes. My associate is on the phone with his clerk as we speak." She held up her phone, where a name was clearly visible on the screen. Davies stared at the name, and what little remained of his composure crumbled. He was a foot soldier being confronted by a 5-star general. He looked from the lawyer to Blackwood, then to Ellie, his expression a curdled mix of fury and fear. Without a word, he snatched the papers from the young social worker, marched to Ellie, and thrust them into her hands. "Temporary kinship placement," he muttered, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "Pending review." He turned on his heel, got into his beige sedan, and sped out of the parking lot, leaving a trail of gravel and humiliation in his wake. The moment he was gone, the tension shattered. Ellie stumbled forward, the papers fluttering in her hand, and pulled open the back door of the government car. 3 small bodies launched themselves into her arms, a tangle of limbs and relieved sobs. "Ellie, you came back!" Ben cried, burying his face in her shirt. Maya clung to her neck, silent but shaking, while Liam just held on tight, his tough exterior finally cracking. Ellie hugged them, breathing in the scent of them, the reality of them. She was whole again. Blackwood watched the reunion from a respectful distance, a faint, sad smile on his lips. When the initial storm of emotion had passed, he approached. "Miss Vance Elara," he said gently, "I have a proposal for you, and for them." He knelt down so he was at eye level with the children. "My name is Silas. A long time ago, I was a boy just like you and I lost my parents. But a kind person saved me. I never got the chance to thank her properly. For my whole life, I've been trying to pay it forward." He then laid out a plan so audacious, so generous, it felt like a dream. "I have spoken with my bankers," he said, turning back to Ellie. "A cashier's check for the full amount of your outstanding mortgage was delivered to your lender an hour ago. The foreclosure is canceled, your debt is cleared." Ellie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Furthermore," he continued, "my foundation will pay to have your house rebuilt. Not just repaired, rebuilt. To your exact specifications, with the best materials and every modern safety feature imaginable." But children need more than a house, they need a home, a family. Here, his voice became serious. I am in the process of filing for legal adoption of Liam, Maya, and Ben. I have the resources to give them everything they could ever need. Stability, education, security for the rest of their lives. Ellie's heart plummeted. He was saving them, only to take them away himself. But Blackwood held up a hand, seeing the fear in her eyes. But I am an old, busy man. I cannot raise them myself. They need a mother. My adoption is conditional on one thing, that the court grants you permanent legal guardianship. You would raise them as your own, in your own home. My foundation would provide a lifetime trust that would cover all their expenses and your own salary, so you never have to work a second job again. You would have every resource you need to simply be their mother. I want to give them a family, Alara. You and them. I just want to be the one who makes sure that family never has to suffer or struggle again. It was an act of breathtaking kindness, a lifeline thrown into the abyss. It wasn't charity, it was a partnership, it was justice. The story didn't end there. As Blackwood's PR team had intended, the local news station, the same one that had given Brenda Higgins her platform, arrived, tipped off about a major philanthropic event. They were now faced with a narrative that was impossible to twist. The story of the heroic foster mom, persecuted by a heartless bureaucrat and saved by an enigmatic billionaire, was irresistible. The cameras rolled as Ellie, flanked by a fiercely protective Silas Blackwood, told her side of the story. This time, her voice was strong. And when the reporter tried to ask Liam a question, the boy stepped forward. Brenda was always mean to us, he said, his voice clear and unwavering as he pointed to her house across the street. She lied. Ellie is our mom. She saved us. From across the street, a curtain twitched. Brenda's face was a mask of shock and fury. Her 15 minutes of fame were over, replaced by a lifetime of infamy in the neighborhood. She had been exposed, not as a concerned citizen, but as the malicious gossip she was. 6 months later, the smell of fresh paint and baking cookies had replaced the stench of smoke and ash. The house stood on the same plot of land, but it was a new creation, full of light and laughter. The floors didn't creak, the windows didn't rattle, and every outlet was safe and new. In the backyard, Liam was teaching Maya how to throw a baseball. Ben was chasing butterflies through a newly planted garden. From the kitchen window, Ellie watched them, a mug of warm tea in her hands. The exhaustion that had been her constant companion for years was gone, replaced by a deep, peaceful contentment. Silas Blackwood, now Uncle Silas to the kids, sat at the kitchen table, looking over one of Maya's latest drawings. It was a picture of their new house. In it, there were 5 figures: Liam, Maya, Ben, Ellie, and Silas, all holding hands under a bright, smiling Sunday. There were no shadows, no fires. She's very talented, Silas said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. She is, Ellie agreed, smiling. She feels safe now. They all do. She looked around the warm, happy kitchen, then out at the children playing freely in the golden afternoon light. The fire had cost her almost everything. It had brought her to the brink of utter despair and showed her the worst of humanity, the coldness of systems, the cruelty of neighbors. But from those embers, something beautiful and unexpected had risen. A benefactor, a guardian angel, a friend. A future she had never dared to dream of. It was a reminder that even after the most devastating fire, after everything has been burned to the ground, kindness could rebuild, love could heal, and a family could, against all odds, rise from the ashes.